Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Stuart Singleton White. I'm head of campaigns at the Angling Trust. Before we start this evening's Sea Angling Forum, I'm sure you will all have heard the sad news that the Queen passed away this afternoon. We have decided that we would go ahead with this forum. We didn't feel it was disrespectful to not go ahead or to go ahead with it, so we've decided to. But we felt it would be appropriate as a mark of respect to Her Majesty to have a minute's silence before we begin. So I hope you'll all join with me in just taking a moment to show respect for Her Majesty and best wishes to the rest of the family at this very sad time. And then we'll start the forum after that. Okay, so thank you very much for that. So welcome to this, the 8th annual or the 8th Virtual Sea Angling Forum of 2022. On this occasion, we're very delighted to have the National Mullet Club back with us. We had a really interesting evening back in July, and this evening we're going to focus in on fishing for mullet with on the fly. So I have with me Andy Burt, Paul Jennings and Colin McLeod from the National Mullet Club. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to them. But before I do, just a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of information on how the evening's going to run. So the first thing is we are recording this session. We do that because we post this on the website shortly after the forum has taken place. And we actually do find that we get quite a number of views to these virtual sea angling forums on our website. So they're a pretty popular thing, and we pick up a much larger audience, you know, as time goes on. So this is a good moment, not only for this evening, but, you know, we're saving it for posterity, I suppose you could say. Working hard with me tonight in the background is Nevin Hunter, our marine coordinator, and Hannah Rudd, our campaigns manager. Nevin is doing all the technical background, so he'll be letting you in, he'll be helping to run the PowerPoints, he'll be dealing with any issues. Hannah will be monitoring and moderating the questions. So let me just explain briefly how the question session is going to work. We're going to have some PowerPoint presentations, particularly from Colin. During that, if you think of any questions or have any questions, I would request that you put them in the chat box. There should be a little icon at the top of your screen with chat written on it. If you click on that icon, it'll open up a chat box and you can type your questions in there. And those are the questions that Hannah will moderate. If we have time after we've dealt with all the questions put into the chat box, we will open the floor to any other questions. Now that will be dealt with by asking you to raise your hand. You can do that if you've not used Teams before by again going to the top of your screen. There should be a button called Reactions with a little smiley face and a big hand. If you click on that, you'll see a hand icon come up underneath it, and you just press that and you'll raise your hand and we'll be able to spot you. If we do come to you for a question, just give us a moment to open your camera and open your mic, and then you'll be able to ask your questions directly of Colin, Paul or Andy. So I think that's probably enough in terms of the introduction. You're not really here to listen to me this evening. You're here to listen to Colin, Andy, and Paul. So I will shut up and I will hand over, I think, to Andy, who's going to do a quick introduction to the National Mullet Club before we hear from Colin. Andy.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the evening. It's good to see you again, especially in these circumstances. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the club, who we are and what we do, and then I'll hand you over to Colin for his presentation, and then subsequently Paul and Colin will answer any of your questions. If there's anything general you want to ask about the club, then I'll come back and hopefully answer the questions for you. Okay, great. Let's get started then. So if we can move on, next slide, please. So who are the NMC? Well, we've been around for a long time. We've been around since 1975. I haven't been a member that long. I've been a member for about 8 years. And the club was brought about basically to fish for grey mullet, learn more about the fishing for grey mullet, and promote the sustainability. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Nevin. All right, great. So the aims of the NMC, I'm not going to read them all out. In today's world, the top one, to promote the interest of those willing to fish for them recreationally. And the bottom one, we're getting a lot of commercial fishing going on in recreational areas and nursery areas. And it's hammering, great hammering bass, gilthead bream, flounders, and all the other fish that use these inshore areas as nursery areas. So that's the two important things at the aims of the club. Next slide, please, Nevin. So we're not 100% catch and release. If somebody wants to take a fish to eat, then it's frowned upon by some. Others, they take an odd one. It's not really going to harm the stock. The stock's being harmed by many other factors. One of them, as you can see from the chart, the decline in grey mullet in the last 10 years has been phenomenal. So we've really got to look at how we can change that and work to change that. And if you move to the next slide, please. So why are they in decline? Well, they're extremely vulnerable, long-lived. They live inshore. There's no real fishery management for them, and commercial fishing is increasing as other stocks. There's more and more pressure put onto mullet. It's important that we work hard and try and get them protection until they're adults and get them fished sustainably. Next slide, please. There's a quick graph there that just shows exactly how long-lived they are. And if you think that to get to about 400 or so centimetres, they're into the sort of 3 pound, 4 pound bracket, not massive, but nice to catch. They're going to be anything up to between 15 and 20 years old. So they've had to survive inshore for 15 to 20 years, extremely long. Next slide, please. The fishing for grey mullet. Why fish for them? It's a challenge, great fun, lovely places, brilliant variety of venues. It's a real challenge. One of the great things about them is who can fish them. Well, everyone. As you can see tonight, we've got mostly game fishermen. You can transition from freshwater to fish you can catch. The coarse angling background, many of us coarse angling background, or as a sea angler wanting another challenge. They're great as a lure angler. There's something there for every fisherman in mullet. So they're a great species. So what do? We hold quite a few get-togethers through the year. You can see a picture there of our recent masterclass, and on the far left is Paul Jennings, who's kindly helped us tonight. So we try and introduce and help people to catch mullet and grow interest in the species. Next page, please. Sorry, next slide, please, Nevin.
Getting a slight delay, Andy.
Yeah, okay, no problem. So, okay, so I hope I've kept that fairly quick. We can make a presentation available for you. There's a bit of information on it if you want to go through it, and you can always contact us and ask other questions. So I'd like to say thanks very much for listening. Really hope you enjoy the evening and find it valuable. I'm sure we all will. And now I'd like to briefly hand you back to Nevin and on to Colin for the main presentation. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks for that, Andy. And I went to the masterclass and thoroughly enjoyed myself. I got knee-high in mud, which was quite fun, and I didn't catch anything, but I learned a huge amount, and I can't wait to go again. But what I particularly want to do as a fly fisherman is learn from Colin and brush up on my skills. So without further ado, let me hand over to Colin.
Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for taking the trouble to join us on a very sad evening. However, it is very pleasing to me to witness the growth and popularity in fly, particularly developed in recent years. And I think that's demonstrated by the Mullet and Fly Facebook group, which now has 9,000 members, which what was until recently considered to be a niche fish. Next slide, please. Yeah, I've been fly fishing for mullet now for 14 years, and during that period, I've been able to share my exploits with the readers of Fly Fishing and Fly Tying magazine in an attempt to encourage people to keep up the mullet challenge, because it was quite lonely when I first started out, so it's quite pleasing now to have some company to have a shoulder to cry on when necessary when the straighten. And during the first lockdown in May 2020, I took the opportunity to write a book called Fly, quite imaginative. That's 303 pages packed with information you need to catch your first mullet and subsequent after that. So it's a worthwhile investment. It's only fly should really start the journey. I don't guide for mullet anymore. I have in the past, but there's many mullet guides out there. So a main reason for the book really was to remotely guide people towards the first mullet. When I first started to fly fish the mullet, was 14 years ago. The general advice back then was don't waste your time fly, but things have moved on significantly since then. And with the availability of effective flies and techniques, I think it's fair to say that we've put a fair old dent in the mullet code, if not quite cracking it yet. You might wonder what type of anglers would become interested in fly fishing for mullet. In my experience, they fall into two categories. Firstly, sea anglers who have decided to take up a new challenge by picking up, and freshwater anglers from a freshwater background looking for a change. The sea anglers probably have a bit of an advantage in terms of knowledge of the tides and marks and how the whole sea thing works. Fly anglers, in that they know how to cast a fly line, they understand the equipment involved in fly fishing, and what I've found is that they tend to buddy up. And when I first became interested in saltwater fly fishing back about 2005, it was quite common to see sea anglers and fly fishers joining together, and they could share their combined knowledge to help each other along the path. Of course, the main core is the bass, because they're slightly more approachable, I'd say, than mullet. As time's gone by, it's really pleasing to see that mullet are becoming more and more. Next slide. The importance of feeding fish. I've chosen that as the first slide because that's probably the most crucial aspect of success and fly fishing for mullet. It'll become apparent as this presentation goes on, but it really is incredibly important. If you can't find feeding fish, then everything, all your work up to that point is only feeding fish for competitive feeding as well, which is a situation where you have a density of fish. In the photograph, you can probably see 10 fish there. They're quite closely grouped, so it's a good density. And these fish are actually feeding that we're feeding at the time when the photograph was and their density is good enough to introduce competitive feeding, which means that if you introduce a fly amongst those fish, their feeding behavior is going to be so heightened that it's really a case of first come, first served to take. So it's really tilting the odds in the angler's favour. If you had the same 10 fish, but they were spread out 20 feet apart, moving quite slowly, then your chances are extremely low. If you learn one thing from tonight, please let it be that you need to find feeding fish. Locations. Newcomers to saltwater fly fishing, from a fly fishing background, can find the ocean extremely daunting, to say the least. In the background of that photograph, you can see the Isle of Wight, so at least it has a horizon. In some instances, all you see is the open sea with no parameters. That can be quite daunting, as I say. So break it down into small segments, and these segments are called marks. Marks are simply locations where there are features persuade fish to hang around, to feed, pick up some kind of residency. So locations are the places to start. Estuaries are by far and away the most productive marks, and that's where the great majority of mullet are caught and fly. I realise that fishers are dotted all around the country, some right in the country. They're going to have a fair distance to travel to find them. My advice would be to choose a close to home as possible. The obvious reason for that is that it gives you the maximum opportunity and explore it and find out what it's all about. And the estuaries really are the best places to choose if possible. They're extremely food rich and biodiverse locations. They offer shelter for mullet. In these locations. So if you can at all choose an estuary as the location to explore. Thanks. They can also provide the river shown in the photograph. There's in East Sussex. There's a chap called Sam Rodman there, prospecting, trying to catch his first mullet. In that photo, we were looking for thin lips because it was probably about 3 miles upstream, and that shows just how far they're likely to travel upstream. Later on that particular day, we ended up 6 miles upstream, catching thin lips as well. The thin lips will, at that stage, the rivers is still tidal, as I say, and they tend to be quite deep enough that the thin lip mullet can remain upstream throughout the whole summer, and there's plentiful food available for them. It's quite a pleasant day to wander a river like that one, just wandering the banks in the sunshine, looking for evidence of mullet feeding in the margins or on the surface. And what we noticed quite quickly was that the shoals tend to be located on bends in the river, and that's a good example of a bend in the river there. So if you're going to go looking for them, then concentrate your efforts on the bends in particular. Thick-lip mullet, they will come into tidal rivers, but only travel perhaps a mile upstream. South Wales has some superb examples of tidal rivers with thick-lip mullet, and the thicklets will travel upstream to the point that they're actually entering the freshwater pools where you expect to find trout. So that's how far they will go. And they're looking for shrimp, as are the tinlets in the East Sussex River. So shrimp are the main items on the menu. And you can get some really large thicks. The largest I've caught in a tidal river is £8.12 on fly, so you can expect some decent fish. Golden greys aren't so keen on travelling up river for that reason, but you will find them at the mouth of estuaries. Next slide, please. Lagoons. Lagoons are effectively small estuaries. That particular lagoon is in Spain. I chose a photograph because it's a pretty photograph, basically. But you'll get the same idea in the UK as well. And lagoons basically fill up on the flooding tide, and then as the tide ebbs, the water runs through the lagoon and out through the narrow entrance, and it creates a current which is similar to the current that you find in an estuary. And these currents are very attractive to all manner of fish, not just mullet species, but predatory fish as well. So they're excellent locations for sport in general. But, again, they'll produce some very large mullet as well. Next slide, please. The open coast. That's certainly a section of open coast that you're looking there. It's about 3 miles long. It's in South Wales again. It's a neap tide, so quite a weak tide, but the water is actually a mile distant. You can just see it on the horizon, so a bit below walking 28 degrees of heat. But that's wonderful golden grey locations, and you'll find similar beaches in the southwest, Devon, and of course South Wales. So that's a place really to be looking for golden greys, especially if you have a river running into a beach similar to that. A prime example might be Hale Estuary on the North Cornish coast, where if you walk to where the river meets the sea at low tide, you will find that golden greys congregate around the river mouth and along the adjoining beach. I've seen shoals probably quarter of a mile long more, and then as soon as the tide starts to flow, a number of these golden greys will enter the river and travel upstream on the flooding tide, while others just simply move in over the sand flats following the edge of the tide. So they give the potential for some fantastic fishing. And we'll talk about approaches for that type of scenario as well. Another occurrence on open coast, which has provided probably some of the best mullet fishing I've ever enjoyed, and again in South Wales, is the occurrence of an algae called Phyoscistus fargesii. And it's an algae that blooms in the shallow water once the water starts to heat up in the early summer. Once it blooms, it dies, and white algae then turns a sort of chocolatey brown frothy material, and it's deposited on the sand as the tide recedes. And then when the tide comes in again, it starts to pick up this brown frothy material, it carries it in the water, and the mullet go absolutely crazy for this stuff because it contains polysaccharides, carbohydrates, and all other manner of nutritious elements. So you can have literally thousands and thousands of mullet feasting on this decaying algae. It doesn't make them any easier to catch. It's definitely worth looking for. Next slide, please. Creeks. Well, if you want to give yourself the ultimate mullet and fly challenge, then creeks probably tick that box. The fish I have in the photograph, they got caught back in July. It was probably 10 years ago since I last caught fish in similar circumstances. The pace of life in creeks is very slow. The availability of food tends to be less than you would find in estuaries, for instance. So consequently, there are less fish that come into these areas. You will see them swimming slowly about, or in the case of that fish, just sitting stationary. I was passing the creek on the way to a stretch open coast, and I thought I've got to have a cast. And it was one of those one cast in 1,000 that the fish decided it was having tagged Romy sand shrimp, and it absolutely smashed it. So always worth having a cast if you're passing a creek. But, they are definitely the toughest venues. Having said that, there's some anglers in London who are fishing the Thames now. As I mentioned earlier, it's best to choose the location that's closest to your home. Unfortunately for them, it's the River Thames, which is not an easy option. But guys like Tim James, they're coming up with some new techniques for creeks, which involve the same type of flies as we use in general for mullet, but they're using an indicator method. So leaving the fly, for instance, a Flexi Worm stationary on the bottom and just waiting for the mullet to pick the fly up. So that's an interesting development. It may make creeks just a bit easier. Next slide, please. Equipment. If we were standing in a lecture hall at this point, we would be showing you various pieces of equipment that I use on a day-to-day basis. So I'll just have to describe them. So please use your imagination. The basic outfit for mullet is a 6-weight outfit with a floating line. It's always a floating line. The reason for that is you're mainly fishing from mullet in very shallow water, often with a bit of current if you're drifting the flies. So you want the fly line to pass over any mullet that are in shallow water. And by shallow, I mean 4 inches to 12 inches. That's your typical depth. You don't want a sinking line or an intermediate line that's going to actually run through the mullet, because that's swimming. So always floating line. 6-weight outfits, ideal, I would say, because it's strong enough to tame mullet. I've had a flathead mullet in Spain to over 11 pounds on a 6-weight that controlled them no problem at all. Bass and things of that nature to 7 pounds, again, very easily controlled. So the 6-weight is strong enough. It's also light enough and delicate enough that if you're fishing for mullet in very shallow conditions, calm conditions, it's an obvious advantage to be using a light setup. You don't want to be putting an 8-weight or 9-weight line on them or near them and possibly spook them. The reel, I would say it's sensible to have about 100 meters of backing, just in case you get that big one. General clothing would be wading boots and waders. Sometimes you have to travel vast areas of coastline to find the mullet feeding, so you want to be able to travel light, so some light waders, a backpack or a sling pack. Try and keep everything down to a minimum. You don't want to be carrying any excess weight with you. A hat and a buff is a good idea, because the coast is often sunny. The reflection off the water, and you can easily end up getting burnt. So a buff is added protection in that respect. Sunglasses will protect the eyes from the glare, and they'll also protect your eyes from hooks. If you look on the fly fishing forums and Facebook groups, you'll see the perennial question pop up every so often. What are the best sunglasses? Well, I would say the best sunglasses are the ones that you can afford. Cheaper ones will certainly work, polarized glasses, but the more expensive glasses, there's no doubt about it, they give you far better vision, and you're often having to look through the water to discover the fish, and if your sunglasses don't afford you the ability to do that, then you're going to be missing on fish, and your catch rate's going to drop. So I really would recommend the best quality sunglasses that you can afford. There's a piece of equipment called a rig, a line rig, and fly fishing has borrowed it from the coarse fishing fraternity, I would say. And it's just a piece of plastic about 6 inches long with some foam in it, and what it enables you to do is make up some leaders with flies attached before you go fishing. And I usually carry 2 or 3 in my sling pack in case I get a tangle. And the reason for that is twofold. One, it can save you a lot of time. On a windy day, if you're standing there trying to tie up a new leader or attach flies, it's going to take a bit of time, and it's extremely frustrating. And it becomes even more frustrating if you get that tangled just as a big shoal of mullets start to feed 10 feet away from you. You do not want to be standing there tying up a new leader when that sort of feeding behaviour is going on. Not very good for your mental health. So prepare some leaders on the rigs so you can have a quick changeover. If I have a tangle leader, I can change it over in less than 1 minute using the rig system. The leaders I use a bonefish leader, which is a tapered fluorocarbon leader. They come in packets 9 feet long. I cut them down to about 7 feet and put a surgeon's loop in the end. And then the rigs that I've just mentioned, I tie them about 6 feet long fluorocarbon, 0.218 millimeter diameter. And again, I attach a loop to the end of the leader, so it's a loop-to-loop connection that you end up with. And that saves you 50% of the fluorocarbon you would use. The stuff I use is about 26 quid for a reel, so you know that's what cost you want to be saving if possible. Tide tables, I would view them as equipment. The cost of the set I've got here for Portsmouth costs about 2 quid, but they're actually worth their weight in gold. The information they contain. Some people may think they're old school because you can use the apps on your phone, but the phone apps, yeah, they're great if you want to look at the tides for maybe next week. But if like me, you want to be planning your next year's fishing in October when these tide tables become available, then you know they're a great piece of kit, definitely. I can plan my whole next season in October based on the information that's contained within the tide tables. Also, if you're trying to catch your first mullet, you've staked out the location and you've been successful, and you've found a productive location, when you're going to have to stake out that location through all the different tides, because in some areas the fish may appear, for instance, on the flood for 15 minutes, and it's a 15-minute window. So if you only investigate your chosen mark on the ebb and then think, oh, this isn't working, I'm going somewhere else, then you're going to miss that period of activity when it does occur in the flood. If you decide after the ebb's been fruitless to, oh, I'll hang on for the flood for a little while, and then after 2 hours you think, no, nothing's happening, and then 10 minutes later the fish arrive, again you've missed it. So you've got to stake that particular mark out right through the ebb, not through the flood, and not just on one tide, because obviously different tides have different strengths, so you have to check them all out. So that's why I recommend that you choose a location close to home, because you really want to be on the water as much as possible to evaluate that particular mark. Maybe on the first few visits, don't take a flyer, take a flask of coffee and a Mars bar and just sit and observe, because you'll learn so much. But when you and the fish eventually do coincide, you need to make a note of that on your tide tables, because they're pretty, mullet are creatures of habit where you have a large enough population. If you've got a few hundred fish, that's large enough to influence their behavior that they will feed regularly in the same place at the same time. Once you've noted that time and place, 2 weeks later you'll have a similar tide. It's a very high likelihood that fish will be back at exactly the same time. And next tide, slide, please. Flies. When I first started fly fishing for mullet, I visited a pretty well-known bass mark, and I was hoping to find some bass at the mouth of an estuary. What I found instead were hundreds of extremely large mullet in a small pool between some gravel bars. The only fly I had on was a white deceiver, a bass fly. I didn't have any mullet flies, so I just decided to have a go with that white deceiver. And for 45 minutes, I was thrashing the water, putting this fly in front of countless extremely large mullet without any reaction. Then my phone rang, and I allowed the fly to drop to the gravel below in about a foot of water. And 30 seconds into the call, the rod was practically ripped out in my hand. And then a large mullet proceeded to jump in the air with the deceiver clearly visible in its mouth. After a few minutes, it threw the hook. That just left me shaking like a leaf. I couldn't hear for the sound of my heart in my ears. And from that moment on, I was just besotted with mullet really. So I went home and googled mullet flies. Apart from warnings, do not go any further, things of that nature. After about 20 pages, I found reference to somebody catching a mullet in a Flexi Worm, so or an Ap's bloodbone. It's a trout version. So I had a few of them in my trout box. Went back the next morning and saw a shoal of mullet approaching up the current. And on the very first cast, I caught a 4-pound fish on the Flexi Worm. So that was it. From that point in time, I really forgot about bass and the beloved trout in the north of Scotland, and I just became fixated on mullet. And that particular fly did me well for the first season. Practically every time I went to the estuary close to my home, I would at least have a fish on, even if just for a few seconds. At least I had a reaction. So I was quite pleased. And I would maybe catch a fish every 3 sessions. And compared to the very rare catch reports that were put on the sea fishing forums at that time, that was a pretty good measure of success. So I was reasonably happy with that. Then in 2010, a friend of mine, Joe Walker, gave me a fly called, they called it Ray's Mullet Bach, Ray's Mullet fly. And it was basically a dieback, which is a traditional Welsh trout pattern. But they had added 2 red glass beads to the head. And Joe gave me one of those flies early June. And that was, for me, the real breakthrough, because I went from early June through to late August, fishing several times a week because I was redundant from a job in the construction industry at that point. So I didn't blank from early June to late August. I mean, that was unheard of. So that was a real breakthrough. And so now I had 2 flies that I could put in the cast, a worm in the point, mullet back on the dropper, and yeah, it was quite good. But there would occasionally rise situations where neither fly would work. For instance, there was a heat wave one year, and the mullet were lying in relatively deep water in a very strong current. So the unweighted flies was just passing over them, and I knew I had to go home, sit at the vise, and come up with an alternative. So I just used the Flexi Worm again, but added lead to the body and a gold bead to the head. Went back the next day and caught mullet and bass. Lost a big sea trout because that fly was getting down to the depth at which the fish were feeding. So, through similar situations as the years went on, I've now developed about 15 different patterns, and they've mainly been in response to a situation where the existing patterns that were in the box didn't quite work. So you have to come up with a solution, and that solution is in a fly. But we're not going to talk about all 15 patterns tonight. So we'll look at the top 6, which really are the sort of flies that you would look to use on a day-to-day basis to catch mullet during the summer. Next slide, please. That's the Romy sand shrimp. That is easily the most productive mullet fly that I've come up with. It's always on my leader. I normally tie it in the dropper, a very short dropper of about 2 inches, and that's to reduce the incidence of tangles when you're fishing in coastal areas which tend to be windy. So that's a problem for newcomers, especially to saltwater fly fishing. They'll end up getting a lot of tangles. So to preclude that, then keep your droppers down to about 2 inches. It means you can't change the fly, of course, but I would never change that fly. It's always on my leader because it is so good. If you want to change the fly, then you can change the point fly. As you can see, it's a light golden coloured fly, and it was created to represent a light golden olive covered shrimp that Joe Walker and I used to find in our wading boots after wading through sand trying to catch golden grey mullet in the Hampshire mark. When we went back to the car park, and we could never catch these devils. When we went back to the car park, took our boots off, these little golden shrimp things were hopping about all over the place. So that's what that fly was intended to represent, but it works anyway. It works over sand, mud, various species. So if I was going to fish with just one fly, that's the fly. Next slide, please. Spectra shrimp, as you can see, it's quite a blingy fly. I saw that material in Fly Fish and Fly Tying magazine and instantly thought that may work for mullet. But when I tied the first one, especially on a gold hook, then I thought, no, that's going to scare the fish rather than attract them. So it sat in my box for a while until I was in Spain one holiday with my daughter Audrey, and we were struggling to catch any fish. And I opened the box and I said, right, Audrey, choose a fly. And she went straight for it, probably because she could see their potential as a pair of earrings, that blingy. So put it on and it just hammered the predatory fish and caught some mullet as well. And strangely enough, I returned to the UK, didn't reach for that straight away in my next session, but it was back in the box again until one day in the Welsh tidal river, all the normal flies were being ignored, and then that was the last resort. Stuck it on, and first cast it caught an 8 pound twin thick, which is recognised as a UK record on a fly rod. Next slide, please. The mullet back, that's the fly that Joe Walker and the Welsh chap called Ray Bramble came up with. The original had some partridge feathers at the end, and it was a much more bushy fly. So I've tended to make the profile more slimline, added the red tag, and it's hopefully improved it even further. But it's a wonderful fly, great for all 3 species. You can dead drift it to thick lips, and it's one of the top 3 patterns I would say. Next slide, please. The Ghostbuster, that's another pattern that was created in response to a problem, and that problem was at my normal mullet mark, thick lips were entering water, in all honesty, 2 to 3 inches deep. So their backs were well out of the water, and they were taking shrimp off gravel in this very shallow current. And of course, you couldn't drift the flies because it was just too shallow. The current was too weak. So I thought a buoyant fly would solve the problem. Came up with that one, and immediately it worked. But it's not just good in very shallow water, it's great round about weed, bladderwrack, for instance. If you've got fish feeding in bladderwrack, then that fly can travel around the weed without getting trapped, and bass love it as well. So it's come up with some really nice fish, so well worth having in the mullet arsenal. Next slide, please. Flexi Worm, that's basically the first mullet fly I ever came up with. I've added a red glass bead to the head, the same as the dieback had. There's absolutely no doubt that the colour red has a major attraction for mullet. Why that should be, I honestly can't say. Maybe in the case of the shrimp patterns that I tie, and I've added a red tag to them, it's possibly when fish approach a group of shrimp, maybe 200 or 300 shrimp, who are all of a similar appearance. If you introduce your fly to that group of shrimp and it's got a red tag, it possibly makes it stand out amongst the crowd and gives the fish something to focus on. That's the only sort of theory I can do. Next slide, please. Mullet ID. It's always useful to know exactly which species of mullet you've got, especially if you're new to the sport. And there's some really simple checks, but confusion, unfortunately, is also simple. Excuse me. I caught this fish back in July, which I was convinced was a thick lip, and I saw the small shoal move into a current to feed. But then, as I walked the fish back towards Andy Ford, who was fishing with that day, for him to take a photograph, I noticed the gold spot in the gill, and I thought, oh my goodness, I've maybe broken the UK record here for the golden grey. But as you can perhaps see, the upper lip already looks quite thick in that photograph, and it was actually a thick lip. But it just shows how confusion can easily enter the equation. Next slide, please. And that's that same fish, and you can see how pronounced the gold spot is, but you can also see that the upper lip is quite thick, as you would find in a thick lip. Next slide, please. Thick lips. Well, it really does as it says on the tin. The upper lip is very thick and it's covered in papillae. And that's a real distinguishing feature of thick lips. Apart from their size, if you see a fish swimming around and it's 5 or 6 pounds, it's almost certainly a thick lip. The UK record on any methods, I think it's about 14 pound 2 ounces. So they do go to a large size, but that thick upper lip is the main identifying feature. And you can see a ghost there is added to that lip there. Next slide, please. Thin lip, again, it does what it says on the tin. Very thin upper lip in comparison to the thick lip. Sometimes you will catch thick lips that have a smooth upper lip. It's still of a good size, but it's smooth without the pattern. And again, that can lead to confusion. But if you look at the pectoral fin there at the base, there's a black circle. Every thin lip I've got has a very pronounced black circle, black spot at the base of the pectoral. So that is your second identifying feature for thin lips. The record is, I think it's about 8.5 pounds roughly now, any method. So size is an indicator again. If it's sort of 3 pound up to 4, chances are it's a fin. Next slide, please. Golden greys. Mullet have the wonderful nickname in Britain of the British bonefish, which is an accolade indeed. And I would say of the 3 species, the golden grey probably looks most like a bonefish. And in a moment, we'll have a look at that bonefish and you can see the comparison. It's obviously got the gold thumbprint on the gill plate there. It has a smooth upper lip and it has a very long pectoral fin. And that testifies the fact that golden greys are related to flying fish because it has an extremely long pectoral. That fish weighed 3 pounds, which is a specimen for golden grey, and it gave a wonderful fight, great run. And as I say, of the 3 species, I would say they're most like the bonefish. And the behaviour, they run hard. Probably the most predatory of the 3 mullet species as well. Catching a single mullet on its own, whether it's a thick lip or a thin lip or a golden grey, is no easy matter, but it's most likely to happen with a golden grey. The UK record is just over 3 pound 8 ounces. So they're the smallest of the 3 mullet species. Next slide, please. And there is a bonefish, which is, I say, there is a fair resemblance to the golden grey in particular. Bonefish, I was asked when I first started mullet fly fishing, what's the fastest, a mullet or a bonefish? And I thought, well, I don't really know, so I need to go bone fishing to find out. And yeah, the bonefish is quicker, there's no doubt about it. But the mullet fights substantially harder. The bonefish is finished within about 5 minutes, whereas a mullet will keep on going. Next slide, please. Techniques for catching mullet. The techniques vary slightly for each species, and we'll have a look at these now for each species. Next slide, please. Thick lips. The most productive location for thick lips, as mentioned, is an estuary. And in the estuary, you will tend to find thick lips feeding in the current where the river runs into the sea. They sit in that current because it's basically a conveyor belt carrying food to them. So they just sit there. It's a bit like one of these Japanese restaurants where you sit at a table and a conveyor passes with all the food on it. And that's pretty much how it is for thick lips in a current. And the most effective technique is called dead drifting. And it's very, very straightforward indeed. You just take up position about 10 or 15 yards up current from the thick lips. It's easy to see where a shoal are feeding because they splash, they jump, and the fins and tails will cut through the surface. So you stand up current 10 yards and just drift the flies towards them, and it's a dead drift. And it really is a dead drift because if you think back to the time when I hooked with my first mullet and it was on a deceiver fly, which the fish ignored for 45 minutes when it was moving through them. But the second that it fell to the bottom and lay there for for a period of time, a mullet decided to pick it up. And I think that's because mullet perhaps see it as one of their functions to mop up detritus, which includes dead organisms, whether it be shrimp, other invertebrates, or small fish. So the fish that are sitting in this current are really looking for dead organisms, and that's a great way of conserving energy as well. So you must really completely dead drift the flies to these fish. If you move the flies in any way, it'll turn them off. I've seen the reaction. It just doesn't fit in with their expected feeding pattern. So don't move the flies, just dead drift them. Keep an eye on the end of the fly line for any movement. And if you suspect that there's any interest, then give a little strip strike. It only needs to be about 6 inches to a foot long, just to set the hook. Excuse me. And then be prepared for the fight for life. Thick lips will, of course, feed in static water as well, outside the current, mainly on shrimp. So if you see thick lips feeding on shrimp, then it's a case of introducing the flies to the feeding fish, and then start off with a slow strip about maybe 12 inches long, and then increase the rate of the strip to induce a take from the fish and get their attention. So by the end, you'll be stripping to get the fish to take, and then again strip. Next slide, please. Fin lips. Fin lips will also be found in estuaries. Again, they're the top mark to find them. And they will also feed in currents in the same way that thicks do, but they tend to sit a little bit deeper in the water. Excuse me. I did 2 talks at the weekend at the festival. Thick lips will tend to sit in water of 6 inches to a foot deep in an estuarine current, but fins can be down to about 3 feet in depth. You locate the shoal because 1 or 2 members of that shoal will break the surface up above, while the rest remain deep. The same approach of drifting the flies to them works, with one difference. Once the flies reach the fish, you then have to introduce that short, quick strip to retrieve the flies. Excuse me, because fins won't respond to simply a drifting fly. It needs to be moving to get the reaction. You can also find them feeding over mud banks, sandbanks, and very shallow water. They come in on the tide, and they're looking for mud shrimps over muddy areas. And they're trying to get to these shrimps before the shrimp return to their burrows. Once the shrimp are in their burrows, they're relatively safe from the mullet's attention. So the mullet know they have to intercept them before they escape. And that's why you'll see them entering very, very shallow water with their backs out. And the same over sand as well. Next slide, please. Golden greys. The fish in that photograph, that was the first mullet caught this season. On the 1st of May, and it was £3 5 ounces, so not a million miles away from the British record. Golden greys, they're really the beach bums of the mullet family. So the aforementioned surf beaches in Cornwall, South Wales are good places to look for them. And on the surf beaches, the approach for the mullet is to wait until low tide, and you see them then advancing over the sand flats on the edge of the flooding tide in very shallow water. And you want to be travelling behind them. And that has a couple of main benefits. Firstly, it can be a pretty windy place to coast. So if you're coming behind the fish in the flood, you're going to have the wind behind your back, which makes casting considerably easier. And also the fish are looking away from you, so they're less likely to be spooked by seeing you tailing them. And the approach is just to drop the flies ahead of them. A good setup in that instance is a Flexi Worm on the point and the mullet back on the dropper. And just keep casting ahead of the fish. And if there's any gentle waves rolling, just let the flies roll about in the wash and just wait for the line to tighten. And that can provide some really interesting sport. You will also find golden greys in estuaries along with the thicks and the thins. And although you do find all three species in an estuary, they tend to be localized in where they feed. As we said, mullets prefer, thick lips prefer the current. Thin lips prefer mainly static water over mud and sand. And the golden greys will be found almost exclusively over areas of sand. So if you have areas of sand in the estuary that you fish, that's where you're likely to find a golden grey. And the best approach for them is to look for them in areas of current around sandbanks. For instance, on the ebb, they'll tend to sit there just picking off food items. So you can drift the flies towards them as you would for thin lip, and then start that strip. Or on the ebb, they tend to sit in deeper water and then rush into the shallows on an area of sand or a sandbank to grab the sand shrimp. The sand shrimp, when they see them coming, they just drop into the sand and bury themselves, escape. So the golden greys got to be in there really quick to get their prey. So the way to ambush them really is to kneel on a sandbank right at the water's edge, so that your fly line is sitting in some water rather than on the sand to keep it clean. Crouch down and look for these fish. They're quite noticeable in clear water. It's really very much like bone fishing in the Caribbean. You'll see the fish coming in looking for shrimp, and you just drop the flies ahead on the sand, and as they approach, then start 12 to 18 inch fairly quick strip, and you should hopefully get a reaction. Next slide, please. Yes, the mullet nymphing technique, which I've just described, whether it's a dead drifting, retrieving in static water, it could almost be viewed as a technique in its own right, I would say, because when I fished for bass prior to taking up the mullet challenge, I fished for bass, and I think the biggest bass I caught was about 1.5 pounds. As soon as I started fishing for mullet and drifting flies, then I started to get 4, 5, 6 pound fish. So that was a bit of an eye opener. And at first, people would say, "Oh, that's a decent byproduct," but it was so successful that, as I say, I think it's almost a technique in its own right. And the bass in the photograph there, that was a 7 pound fish. That was tied on a mullet back, but I tied it on a heavy, strong hook, deliberately to go looking for bass in an area of strong current. And I just drifted that fly, and that fish absolutely smashed it. And I honestly couldn't list the amount of species that have fallen to that particular method. And the small mullet flies, it's quite surprising to a lot of people that size 12 shrimp patterns can account for such big fish. And I think probably the strangest catch I've had is shown on the next slide. It's a thornback ray, and that was to a weighted Flexi Worm. I mentioned that earlier when I went home to the vise and added lead and stuff to the body to get down deep to the mullet, and they were sitting in a trench as well, and that thing came out of the trench and found it. So that was quite a surprise. So that's one of the great things I think about saltwater fly fishing, is you can never quite be sure what is going to take the fly next. Next slide. Playing a mullet. That's probably a chapter I should have put in the book in hindsight, because it's the end part of the product. It's obviously a very fraught time, and it really starts off with that strip strike that I mentioned. If you don't strip strike to set the hook, if you simply lift the rod as you would if you're trout fishing, then excuse me, the chances are high indeed that fish is going to throw the hook within the first minute. So you've got to set the hook. The mullet, especially large ones, will tend to spend the next few seconds just sitting there as if to make sure what's happened before launching into a hard, fast, long run. And it's a good thing for them to run, I think, because it tires them out. So set the drag so that they can run and use up some of that energy. And they tend not to run for snags. They're not very snag-minded, but they will on occasion head for something to see, such as buoys or occasionally swans. So if you think that's happening, then you've got to apply concerted side pressure to steer the fish away from any possible snags, because if they hit that snag, then it's game over. So don't be scared to place a lot of side pressure to steer that fish away. And that's the advantage of using fluorocarbon of, say, 10.4 pounds as I do. Although it's only 0.218 millimeters, which is quite thin, it's strong enough to be able to blow that fish away. If you catch a thick lip in a current, then it's probably going to try and use that current to its advantage. When they're getting tired, they can sit in the current and rest, but you're still under a lot of tension on the rod because the current's coming into play. So it's good advice to remove the fish from the current as quick as you possibly can. Get them into the shallows and start the water and play them out in the shallows. When you do think he's almost ready for the net and you've managed to lift his head just above the water for the first time, you're starting to breathe for the first time, 15 minutes, be prepared for quite a severe reaction. When mullets see the net, they know that they're in trouble, and you get a very strong reaction. They'll turn and they'll run away again. Some people try and hold the fish to prevent it from running, and you'll often pull the hook or snap the leader. So be prepared for that strong reaction and just let the fish run again, because he's probably only going to run 5 or 10 yards at most. And it may take 4 or 5 attempts to actually get into the net, because each time he sees a net, be prepared for the reaction. There's a lot of fish are lost, unfortunately, right in the net. Next slide. Top 10 tips. These may seem like small things individually, but they all add up to something grander. And I think any advantage you can get from fly fishing from the water is certainly worth investing in. The mullet season. In the southwest of the country, you can almost fish for mullet all year round, and it's the same in Southern Ireland. I know people that catch mullet in January and February. On the south coast, they tend to appear sort of mid-April and become a viable target late April, early May, and they tend to hang around until 3rd week in October, when coincidentally heavy rains tend to fall. That seems to cool down the estuaries, particularly, and the mullet seem to move off. And so sometimes you'll find them into November still shoaling, but they're just not really feeding. I think the food chain has disappeared by then, so they're just getting ready for migration for the winter. The further north you go, where the water temperatures are cooler, the season's shorter. It might be June before they appear, and they may move off in September. So really, the further south and west you go, the longer the season. Hooks. For I tie my flies on Camazan hooks, B100s and B170s. And the reason for that is when I first started fishing for thick lips, which were present in a current, I needed a good strong hook that was also quite light, so that it could actually drift on that current. I tried some thicker hooks to begin with, and they just fell to the bottom. So they were too heavy to drift. So that drifting factor is very important. And that's why I arrived at Camazan hooks after trying many different brands. They were the brand that I arrived at. Swans. You'll often see swans, especially in estuaries, and sometimes many hundreds of swans. And a lot of anglers look upon them as a pest. But I've learned over the years that often where you see swans feeding, you'll also find mullet. And at first I used to think that was because swans and mullet feed on the same things. But now I think it's because during their feeding activity, the swans are stirring up the bottom, and they must be releasing a lot of food. And the mullet know that when they see the swans move into a certain position and start to feed, that food is going to become available so that the fish move in amongst them. So it's always worth prospecting swans if you see them. Competitive feeding, that was the very first slide we mentioned, because, as I say, without competitive feeding, catching mullet flies is quite a tough gig. So you need to learn what competitive feeding looks like, what feeding fish look like. And as I've mentioned several times, the location that you choose to fish, whether you've been put onto that location by someone else or you've chanced upon it yourself, through research or using Google Earth. That's a good tool for looking at the coastline and choosing suitable locations to visit. You may find, if you're unfortunate, that despite visiting that location regularly, all the stages of the tide, etc., the fish simply don't feed, or there's so few fish there that competitive feeding is not going to take place. And if that's the case, then my advice would be to just forget that mark and move on to another one, because it's probably never going to become good, and they're just making life too difficult for yourself. Tide tables, we spoke about those already. Quite a vital bit of kit. Fluorocarbon. I always use fluorocarbon. One of the main reasons for that is I've tried nylon in the past because I had it in a trout bag and it was cheaper. And nylon monofilament is one of the very few things that I've witnessed spooking shoals of mullet regularly, especially if it's your first cast of the morning. The nylon's going to lie on top of the water and it coils. If it's sunny, it picks up the sunshine and it glints, and it just has this incredibly detrimental effect on mullet, and they're long gone. It's quite incredible. Nothing else will spook them in the same way, in my experience. Fluorocarbon has the advantage of sinking more readily than monofilament, and that's an advantage, especially in saltwater, because it's more buoyant than freshwater for a start. So you need to get the leader below the surface to avoid spooking them. Long leaders for close-up. If you're targeting finlet mullet, golden grey mullet in very shallow water, where they're coming towards you from the flooding tide, and again, when I say shallow water, I'm talking 3 inches, 4 inches, often is the case. You have to crouch down and get on your knees, keep a low profile. And as these fish come towards you, you don't want the fly line to land on them, because that will most likely spook the shoal instantly. And if you spook a shoal in those sort of circumstances, it's almost like a domino effect. You don't just spook the fish that are immediately in front of you. The panic just spreads along the whole sandbar. I've seen it 400 meters long. It's incredible. And those fish have gone. So what you really want is the fluorocarbon leader to land on the fish, especially if there may be a few fish even closer to you than you realize that you haven't seen. They're the ones that can be put off by the fly line. But you just want the leader to land on these fish. So use a long leader, 14 feet, 16 feet. You've probably only got a few feet fly line outside the rod tip. It's that close. So get the long leaders, and that will really up your catch rate. The colour red, well, we've seen plenty of evidence in that, in the group of flies that I showed you. As I say, no doubt about it, colour red attracts mullet, so I would always have the colour red in any fly fishing for mullet. Blend in, especially in shallow water, if you're wading or if you're kneeling for fish in shallow water. But by blending in, I mean if it's a sunny day, we'll tend to wear a blue top. So you've got the blue sky as a background. If I'm going in amongst swans for a session, then I'll put on a white top. I know it maybe sounds a bit petty, but it really works. You can get right up close to the swans and the fish will seeing you. And again, that's the sort of thing that improves your catch rate. And leader rigs, we already touched on them. They're the pre-prepared leaders on a holder that allow you to change the leader when necessary in a very quick period of time. Next slide. And this is the last one. The telephone symbol, that's just a reminder that the sea can be a dangerous place, especially where mud's concerned. We do a lot of our mullet fishing in areas of mud, soft sand, and people do become stuck. We just had the Orvis Festival, Saltwater Festival at the weekend in Halen Island, and a few people got stuck. The mud was only probably 2 or 3 inches deep, but it was still enough that their feet got stuck and we had to come and take a shoulder each and lift them out. But some people do become properly stuck, and unfortunately, each year, some people do lose their lives. So you really must treat mud with caution. And in case you do fall into any trouble, then it's good advice to have the harbour master and the Coast Guard's phone numbers on your contact list, just in case. And the other slide just shows it's actually a ball that that guy's holding, not some unfortunate angler's head who's gone up to his neck. But it's just a reminder that you really must treat them with respect. That's the last slide. Thank you very much. Questions will come later.
Thanks very much for that, Colin. I think now we hand over to Hannah, if she's there. There's been a number of questions that's come in through the chat box. So, Hannah, do you want to lead on the question and answer session?
Yes, thanks, Stuart, and thanks to the guys for a great presentation and for all of the questions in the chat box. The first one comes from Mark, who asks, how can you tell fish are feeding? I fish a river and they cruise up and down just under the surface, but rarely feed.
Do you want to answer that one, Paul?
I think you're on mute, Paul.
Can you hear me now?
Excellent, yeah. Okay,
great. Feeding fish. Yes, like Colin said, you've got to find whether they're feeding or not, or you're going to spend a lot of time. You've got to tell the difference between cruising fish and feeding fish, and there's various ways. On a current, they could well be taking things off the top and being very splashy. That's very true of thick lips. If you're in skinny water, and you got good glasses on and you see the fish, it's about observing them, and feeding fish will flash on the sides quite a lot. That's a telltale sign. And it's also a matter of how quickly they are moving around. If you can see them, you can see whether they're looking around for food or whether they're just cruising. Occasionally you can get them to feed by getting them to getting them to be competitive. If you've got a shoal and they're not really feeding, a quick rip between with the fly can actually get them going. But very much those are the signs you're looking for: active motion, not cruising.
Great, thank you. That's actually all the questions I can see in the chat box at the moment, but we've got some hands going up, so I will hand over and give some privileges. Pete Wilkins, you're first. I'm just going to allow your microphone and your camera. If you'd like to unmute yourself, the floor is yours. Pete, I don't know if you're trying to speak, but you just need to press the unmute button first so that we can hear you. Okay, we'll come back to you, Pete, in a minute, whilst you're figuring the technology out. We've had some more questions come through in the chat in the meantime. And Alan asks, what was the title of your book? And the audio faded out when you said so.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's a Mullet and the Fly. Hopefully.
There it is.
Little plug.
Excellent plug, yeah. And where can people buy your book?
You can buy it from Cocky Bundy Books online and at Amazon as well, I believe. But if you Google Colin McLeod, Mullet and Fly, then it takes you to a link.
Excellent, thank you. Sounds good. Pete, I don't know if you want to try again. It won't let you unmute. I don't have the ability to unmute you. I've already enabled your microphone and your camera. So you should be able to unmute yourself at the moment. If not, in the interim, we will try and give someone else the opportunity whilst we're just figuring out that technology. So Nick Moat, your microphone is now enabled, so fingers crossed you have the opportunity to unmute yourself. Does that work for you, Nick? Okay, seems to be an issue with technology then. I don't know whether Nevin and Stuart could look at this in the background whilst we go through a few more questions. We haven't come across this issue before, so I'm sure we can resolve it. So just going back to some of the questions in the chat in the meantime, Eamon asks, can you suggest any good marks around the country where a beginner has a chance to pick up the ropes and have some success?
We don't get into specifics in locations, but what I can say, once you've found some mullet, stick with it. It's really, really important to get a spot that you can visit over and over again, because they are quite reliable in their habits, and you want to eliminate all the downtime. And you will find an hour or maybe 2 hours where they turn on and feed on each part of the tide, whether that be flood or red. But it's really quite important, and I know it's difficult for those that are a long way away, but if you can find a mark and visit it and get to know it, that will really save you a lot of time in the long run. But as Colin said, estuaries are top.
Great, thank you. So moving on to the next question, Peter asks, what weight of lead would you recommend? I usually fly fish for sea bass on a WF8 weight.
A fly line, yes, a 6 weight is ideal. You can go right down to a 4 weight quite easily. You could go up to an 8 weight if that's what you have, but I would recommend a longer leader, so you're keeping the fly line back from the shoal. But a 6 weight's the sort of the balance. Strong enough to tame large fish, but still with a degree of delicacy.
Okay, great. Bear with me just one moment. The next question is from John, who says, I'm a little surprised that none of your mullet flies contain orange components. I use several shrimp fly patterns with orange components for sea trout in Scottish estuaries. Have you tried orange for mullet?
No, because red, as I said, I've tried some red, orange tags, and yeah, they did work. But to me, red is by far the most attractive color to mullet. Why that should be, I really don't know. It certainly works.
I'd say try orange. Try it.
Excellent. Yeah, you can only try, can't you? So Nevin informs me that Andy has some questions that were sent in advance. So I'm just going to hand over to him to deal with those whilst we try and resolve the technology issues and allow the other questions to be answered. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. Yeah, we had a couple of questions come in advance, and one is a topic that we haven't touched on yet, and that's about license requirements when you're fishing for mullet, and especially with respect to catching salmonid species. And the question was mainly relating to Wales and West England. And a number of years ago, I ran past this with Natural Resources Wales and the Environment Agency. And it's important to realise that you don't need the freshwater rod licence to fish for mullet or any species of sea fish. It simply covers fish that are covered by the Salmon and Freshwater Fisheries Act. So as long as you've got the right to be fishing there and there's mullet there, then there's nothing to stop you. And the same goes for bass. And indeed, they both assured me, that's Natural Resources Wales and the Environment Agency, that unless they actually caught someone who was physically taking salmonids away, and they could quite easily demonstrate that they were fishing for mullet or sea bass, then it would never ever result in a prosecution. So I think the message is you're perfectly allowed to do it. It's not up to you to prove to somebody else that you're mullet fishing. It's for them to prove otherwise. And certainly, unless you have a salmon or a salmonid sea tray in your bag, you're not allowed to have. There's absolutely no problem. And the other question is quite interesting, and for Paul and Colin, Now, there's a chap who's interested in fly fishing for mullet and in the Outer Hebrides. And I remember seeing last year on the White House in Waltham go fishing in the Outer Hebrides, fishing for sea trout as it happened. And they were looking at the mullet and the lagoon. And he'd like to ask how we should go about that. So if I could ask Paul and Colin how they would go about fishing for these, obviously thick lip in the Outer Hebrides. Away you go.
You can have that one, Colin.
I suppose I'm Scottish, so I should know the answer. But yeah, I've heard for a number of years now reports of large numbers of mullet in the Outer Hebrides, Inner Hebrides. So this may be a venue for the future, certainly. But I've not heard of any being caught. But I would think that the same techniques would work if you can find these mullet feeding around where the river runs in the sea. Then you can try the drifting technique to them there, because that's the best method. Or just introduce shrimp patterns such as the Romy sand shrimp or the Spectra shrimp. The Spectra shrimp is one of only 2 patterns I've experienced that thick lips will actually chase. It's not because they're lazy fish that they don't chase, it's just sitting in the current. But the old Victorian fly, the red tag, and the Spectra shrimp, they're the two patterns that thick lips will noticeably chase and really chase hard. So you could put those in amongst them and start a fairly quick retrieve and see what happens. But I guess they'll be feeding on shrimp, these thick lips. So if you can find out what sort of shrimp are in the area and try and mimic them, tie a fly to represent them, or just try the Romies and a Spectra as we do. They're good searching flies, the Romies and the Spectra. In waters that you're not familiar with, you put them on, and they tend to work wherever you are. So that would be my advice. But please let us know how you get on.
Okay, great. You got anything to add, Paul?
No, not on that one.
Okay, cool. Right. Chap's got a house in Milford on Sea in Hampshire. And he wants to know if there's a club or guides that can start him on the fly, and he's a reasonable fly angler. I would say the obvious club to join is the NMC, and we'll help point him in the right direction. And then as for guides, if I can hand you again over to Colin.
I don't really know of any guides who offer their services. I guided in the past for a number of years until 2014, when the mullet population at the archive, I suspect the fish migrated in the winter after being there since the 1960s, and they never came back the following spring. So I think it's safe to assume that the commercial nets had decimated the bass stocks, decided to turn to mullet, and that's a particular population of mullet, along with several Sussex and several Northern Ireland and Welsh populations as well. So at that point I thought, no, I can't guide anymore, because one, I have to go and find new locations now where I can fish for mullet, and I realised then just the amount of pressure that they were under. So so there's lots of bass guides around, and
yeah, there's also a lot of information out there now on the Mullet on the Fly forum on Facebook, but also on YouTube. There's an awful lot to be picking up there, and a lot of times it's just going out there and looking and trying it out.
Yeah,
because it's a guide in itself. And as Paul says, Mullet on Fly Facebook group, 9,000 members, lots and lots of information.
And of course the book.
There is the only time I guide now, along with Paul, is at the Orvis Saltwater Fly Fishing Festival, which takes place in September in Highland Island. So there are workshops and guided sessions there. So that's worth considering. And they do have a beginners weekend as well in June, where complete beginners can have a weekend being caught fish for saltwater species, not just mullet bass as well.
Of course, as a club, we recently held the masterclass as well at Hayling Island, didn't we?
Yeah.
And that's a completely free to enter event. And it's the same for, I mean, I'm mostly bait fish. You have to learn the techniques, I think, and it's about learning the techniques and where to find them. And Colin's especially has gone into great detail of that tonight. And then going out and finding a few and then applying those techniques yourself. So I would suggest the Orvis Festival, and next year we'll be running another mullet masterclass, which just can reassure you that you're doing the right thing. And then it's just a matter of finding them and following the advice of these guys, and hopefully success will follow.
Yeah, I find these Facebook groups, if you go on them and say, look, I'm in this area, keen to get started, you'll always get somebody who'll say, look, I live near from like, so they're always ready to help. But if I'm honest, for me, the period of time I was hunting my marks, that was the most rewarding time of my mullet fishing. You know, so it's a shame to miss out on that, really, because you really get the satisfaction from doing a lot of it yourself.
Can I pop in now or not?
I've got one more question, and then welcome to chat. The last question. There's which is on the fresh side of a lock in a harbour, where he catches a lot of mullet on the Mep spinner and our ragworm, which are obviously thin lips, and it's a recognised technique. And he says he's unable to catch them on flies. And he's tried most of Colin's flies, but to no avail. So I was, from what we've heard, it's not the flies, it's how you're fishing them. So what do you reckon?
Yeah, it's depth of water as well. He might be trying, if he's spinning, you obviously got to have a depth of water, so it may well be too deep for the fly. Look in the margins, they will follow a fly, and they'll also take get a lot of mullet on the lift off, just like you do with trout. So it's important to see if they're following your fly but I would suspect he's trying it too deep, but that's just an assumption of mine. But try a bit shallower and try the margins.
Thanks, good advice. Colin?
Yeah, exactly what Paul said. I would say it's a water depth. And, you know, one of the golden rules of fly fishing for mullet is you should be in water 3 to 12 inches deep. If you're standing in water knee deep, then you're probably getting too deep.
And if you're on the freshwater side of a lock, the chances are you've got more than a foot.
Yeah, I've caught thicks in fresh water, and they're looking for shrimp, the same as anywhere else. But,
okay, great. So if I can hand you back to Pete, who's online now, and Hannah. Thanks very much.
Okay. Evening, everybody. Hannah, you asked a question about finding mullet, and you were seeing cruising mullet but none feeding. What I would suggest is usually they're doing that when they're waiting to go to a feeding spot, and they go to a feeding spot every day. They follow the same routine. What I would suggest is looking for low water marks with mud and finding mullet scrapings. And once you find where the mullet scrapings are, you will find then the mullet when they come in. Would you agree with that, Colin?
Peter. Yeah, there's like scraping, and they are.
Great, thanks, Pete. Was that what you wanted to say, or did you have a question as well?
Just wanted to say, to carry on when you were speaking earlier, that you know they're probably just holding there, waiting to get to the spot they want to feed in. And they do the same every day, but if you went a little bit further up or below that, you'll probably find that they find the bay where the scrapings are in, and you'll find that's the spot where they're going to be feeding.
Excellent. Well, thanks for your contribution, Pete. We're sorry, I can hear a lot of feedback at the moment, but we're just coming up for 8:30. Would you both be okay to hang on for just 10 more minutes just to go through some more questions? Would that be okay?
No worries.
Okay, great. So we're just going to return to the chat box quickly, and I'll try and alternate between chat box questions and those with your hands up, and see how we go. If we don't get to all of the questions, I will pass them on to our speakers this evening. Hopefully they will be able to answer those, but I'm volunteering them for that at the moment. So feel free to say otherwise, guys. But just going back to the chat box now. Francis asks, there has been discussion on Mullet on the Fly about using static flies resting on the bottom in muddy estuaries. Does anyone have any experience of this?
I don't, but I got a friend that does, and yeah, I think what they're doing is putting a worm on static with an indicator. I don't have any experience of that, but I have a couple of friends that are starting to pick up mullet consistently, so it's something I might have a go at, but not on that particular one for me. Colin?
Yeah, I think it's probably in water where the clarity is poor. So I mean, the typical fishing, for instance, Paul and myself do, and a lot of people on the south coast, it's in clear water, so it's very much sight fishing. But if you are fishing Thames where water clarity is poor, this is a technique that they've come up with there, and it seems to work, which is and it's just a case of leaving that worm fly on the bottom, waiting for a fish to find it in the very poor water clarity and pick the fly up. And I think initially they were missing a lot of the takes, so they were too slow to strike. So that's why they started to use an indicator. So they just watch the indicator, which is a bit like float fishing. And then when you see the indicator move, then they would strike, and that increased their success rate. So yeah, it's a new technique. It's similar to what I described in my PowerPoint presentation about following the golden greys in over the sand. There's one area in Hampshire I fish where the water clarity is very poor, but it's the same situation. And with the worm, I would cast it ahead of where I assumed the fish to be, and just leave it there, or give it a very, very slow move every so often. Just hang on to the line, and eventually one would take the fly and go. So there's just using an indicator to make it that little bit easier to see when a fish has shown interest in the fly. So yeah, it's a new technique, and it seems to be working. So it's one to watch.
Are these guys, Colin, are they catching predominantly thins or thick lips?
Thicks, I think. Yeah.
Thin lips in the Thames, and the videos they've posted, the clarity is like zero. So they've done extremely well to pick up fish in those circumstances. It's probably the only way to catch fish.
Yeah, a lot of thin lips in the Severn near me, which is extremely coloured. So it'd be an interesting technique to try there.
I would guess it would work equally well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So moving on to the next question, sorry, because I'm just conscious of time. Bill asks, does weather make any difference? All Colin's pictures seem to be on a dry, sunny day.
It's because I'm sunshine. But no, it makes no difference in my experience. I've caught mullet in the pitch dark. I've caught them on 32 degrees of heat, pouring rain, howling winds. What really affects them is the tide and the time that they feed during that tide. So they're food orientated. They're not really bothered about the weather.
Okay, great, thank you. Alan asks, doesn't the rod license requirement kick in a certain distance from the sea?
No, it doesn't. No, it actually extends all the way out to the 6 mile limit for species detailed under the Salmon and Freshwater Fisheries Act. So that's salmon, sea trout, any coarse fish, and also smelt and the European eel. But it's specific to the species. It's nothing to do with freshwater or seawater.
Great, thanks, Andy. Simon asks, what knots do you favour for forming leader loops and for fly attachment?
Say that one again.
What knots do you favour for forming leader loops and for fly attachment?
Perfection loop for me on the loop on the leader, and I tie my shrimp flies direct with just a grinner knot basically. I don't tuck it because it's just easy for me to undo it, but that's what I do.
I'll just go for surgeon's loop for the loop-to-loop connection, and a half-tuck blood knot for connecting fly, simply because my granddad taught me that when I was about 8 years old, and I've never forgotten it, and it's never let me down.
Great, thank you. John asks, have you tried larger than size 12 hooks for your mullet flies?
Personally, no. 12's the largest. I've gone down to 14.
Yeah.
That just seems the right size for the type of shrimps trying to imitate with our patterns. So what do you think?
You probably can go bigger, but what we do works. So I'm a bit afraid to go bigger, to be honest. But no, 12 and 14 for me.
Great, thank you. So we're just going to make the switch from chat box questions to those with their hands up. So Nevin, given presenter privileges to those with their hands up at the moment. So Clive Pavley, if you'd like to unmute yourself, the floor is yours.
Thanks, guys, but you've covered what I was going to ask, so press on to the next one.
Great, thank you. Definitely a comprehensive overview tonight, I think. I've got a guy, excuse me, I'm sorry I don't have your name, but I have your almost code name, I guess. Badger, would you like to unmute yourself?
Badger.
Yeah, I didn't think I'd get away with that one, but Colin.
Yeah, we know who it is.
Excellent.
So last weekend, one of the places I was fishing, there was a plateau with deep water either side of it, and there was a sort of like almost like a vapor trail of mullet leading away into the current, and they would occasionally come onto the plateau, but you would see fish flashing out in the current in the deeper water, and I was ignoring them because close by there were fish out of the current that were definitely not feeding, or they were just sitting around and going around in circles very slowly. The ones that were over the deep water, they would be between 6 inches and a foot down, and they would occasionally flash. Do you think they could be feeding the things that are washed off of the plateau? And you could target them with a Ghostbuster and a Spectra or something on the dropper?
Yeah, definitely. If you think the currents at fish tend to be, foot deep. Sometimes they're maybe 2 feet. That's a little bit deeper than normal. In fact, you know the place I'm probably talking about.
Yeah.
That in itself is a little bit deeper than normal. But my suspicion is it doesn't matter if it's a foot deep, 5 feet deep, or in the case of the place you're talking about, it could even be 10 feet deep. The fact is, it's feeding in the top foot. So the current, no matter how deep it is, it's still carrying food. And if you're seeing those fish flashing, that's a sign, that's an indication of feeding. But there's in the top foot, so you want your flies to be in the top foot.
Yeah, that was a difficult scenario, that one, Dave. I know I saw those fish, and it was quite a fast current, so you'd have to get down, maybe the grayling on an indicator type, heavier fly, but you have to play around with that one, don't you?
I would say a weighted worm, heavy flexi worm, maybe with a buoyant worm above it acting as an indicator as well. Just drift the worm pattern through them. So
my hands are sitting here. My hands are sitting here on my vice, and I've been listening to you talk, tying different weights of different types of hooks to try and get to different types of weights. So we'll have another go.
Experimentation, that's key.
And by the way, Colin, that permit over your right shoulder, it's the wrong way up.
No, it's a box or something. It's a
that's fly box.
It's been annoying me for about an hour, but anyway, neither in or there. Thanks, chaps.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, we've got about 2 more minutes left. So I'm just going to whiz through the chat box and ask any remaining questions. If you hear any background noise, I apologise. It's my German Shepherd puppy making a lot of noise. Mark Singleton asks, I have a gifted FW7WT rod. Any advice on a saltwater reel setup to get me going? I am a river fly angler.
Oh, you've got more tackle than I have.
Yeah, depends on how much you want to do. You can go real simple and real cheap by getting an airflow carbon reel, which are really, I can't remember the name of them, but you can go really cheap with a reel that's going to hold up to the salt. You can use your trout reel, but you got to wash it really, really well. Anything that will hold, with the decent drag is quite important. Anything that hold a 6-weight with plenty of backing will be fine. I happen to like Danielson, but everybody has their own favorite. Orvis do great reels. It depends on how often you're going to do it. You can either spend a lot of money or not, but most important thing, you're in salt water, you got to take care of it, and it has to have a good drag.
Great, thank you. And one final one before we hand over to Stuart. A bit of a theory session, I suppose, to end. Minvis says, from my very few encounters with mullet, they're not very spooky fish. They don't seem to mind anglers even a few feet away. And if they are coming to estuaries and shallow bays not to feed, or feed very in little short periods, any theories what their main purpose to visiting the marks where we can try and catch them is?
They'll be coming in for food at some point, and don't be too sure that you haven't spooked them. Sometimes they'll see you and not spook, but they'll ignore you all day long. So it's always best to try and sneak up on them. I see a lot of anglers go in wading before they've cast the water they're stepping into, spooking all sorts of shoals. Sometimes they'll spook for a long time. Sometimes they'll just reset, especially in high traffic areas when there's boats and birds and paddle boards and all the rest of it. They get used to it. But it's just observation. You still may have spooked those fish, but they're just going to choose to ignore you rather than run away. Colin might want to add to that one.
If I understood the question correctly, as Pete Wilkins said earlier, often it's just travelling. If they come into an estuary and they're not, they're just travelling, set speed, set direction, all in like a pack, then they're just travelling somewhere. You know, that they're on their way to a particular place, and hopefully they're on their way to feed somewhere. So you really want to be tailing those fish if you can. Just follow them up the estuary to see where they go, because that's why they would normally enter an estuary is to feed. So from the particular point where you intercept them, then be prepared to follow them further up the estuary, because it's where they may well start to feed.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to hand back over to Stuart. Thank you everyone for your questions this evening. We will collate those, and any that we haven't answered we'll hand over to the National Mullet Club to respond to in their own time if they have time. But thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and for this evening.
Thank you, Hannah, and particularly thank you to Colin, Paul and Andy for an absolutely fascinating evening. I've learnt a huge amount, and I can't wait to get back with one of you guys or somebody else and give it another go and try and improve my skills a bit. Just before I sort of close the session as well, Bill was asking, he obviously lives near Hayling Island or over at Langston or someone like that, because he says he can see the Orvis Festival from his window and he wants to know how often it takes place. I think it's annual, isn't it? It's once a year in that first week of September. So Bill, you'll have to wait till next year now, but do go along. It's a fantastic event. So thanks very much for the evening. I thought it was a great evening. Thanks for all the questions as well. I thought it was a really good and interesting discussion. As we usually do at this stage, as well as thanking our presenters, I'm really turning to you as our audience. We do these forums regularly. We're always keen to hear from you, to hear what you'd like us to cover and what you'd like us to get presenters in and to talk about on these evenings. So do let us know. There's two ways you can do that. You can either drop us an email, or Nevin will be sending around a sort of survey questionnaire in follow up to this to see how your experience was, how we can improve it. And as I said, what topics you'd like to discuss in the future. So that should come out in the next week or so. We've also, as I've said, recorded this at the beginning, so we will be posting this on our website. So if there's anything you missed, I shall certainly be going back and looking at the flies and looking at some of the technique things again to see what I can learn. But if there's anything else you've missed, do please go and view this on our website. It'll be on the C pages of the Angling Trust website. And before I close the evening, I'd just like to say that this is actually Nevin's last virtual sea angling forum with us. Nevin will be standing down as our mooring coordinator soon. He will be sorely missed.
Yes.
We have enjoyed and really valued the work that Nevin has done. We will be replacing Nevin. I will reassure you of that. It's one of my priorities to do that. But I'd just like to publicly really pay tribute to Nevin and thank Nevin very much for all the hard work he's done, not only in these sea angling forums, but for other sea angling sort of activities within the Angling Trust, for creating our volunteer network and really building that up. He's developed a fantastic foundation for us, and I'm looking forward as head of campaigns to build on that as soon as we can get a replacement in post. And I will reassure you that these virtual forums will continue. We will be continuing to organise them. I will be taking on that role until we found a replacement for Nevin. So thank you, Nevin. And finally, thank everybody for a really fascinating evening, and for you all sticking with it, and for your questions and your interest. I think, saltwater fly fishing is an absolute growing sport, and a really exciting one. So thanks very much. And I think with that, I'll say good night and enjoy your evening, everybody.
Thanks very much, guys.
See you.